Okay, thank you, everybody. I'm Walter Rowe. I'm the Secretary of NCAS, and today I'm introducing our speaker for the day, Scott Snell. Scott Snell is a software engineer at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, attending the onboard computer of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. Among his previous missions was the Compton Gamma Ray Observatory, a school bus-sized spacecraft which he helped safely deorbit into the South Pacific Ocean at missions in. In other words, he deliberately crashed it. Received his bachelor's degree in physics from the University of Maryland. He's a charter member of NCAS, served as its president since 2018. Today he'll be presenting a talk entitled, "The Times They Are or Aren't a-Changin'." Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Snell.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you, folks. And before I get started, I am the current president of NCAS, but when I'm giving some opinions today, that doesn't represent the National Capital Area Skeptics or any other organization I'm associated with. Also, the talk will include some products. I don't have any financial connection to these products, and I'm not endorsing them, merely putting them in front of you for your consideration. All right, so the title of my talk is "The Times They Are or Aren't a-Changin'," and that harkens back to this album and the title track. 60 years ago, right about now, Bob Dylan finished recording this important album. And of course, he wasn't singing about changing clocks. It was a time of great social upheaval. But it does have some relevance, and we'll see that in a few slides from here. By the way, just by coincidence, Dylan's going to be here in Maryland in just a week. Next Friday and Saturday, he'll be performing up in Baltimore. So that's...
Just a little louder. I haven't got my hearing aids in.
Oh, yes. I've been asked to speak a little louder. I'll do that. So... Anyway, Dylan's going to be in Maryland next weekend. He's in Philly tomorrow night. And as I said, the times, they are a-changing twice a year right now. As we know, spring ahead, fall back. And we move clocks ahead by 1 hour in the spring from standard time to daylight saving time. And by standard time, I mean, roughly speaking, the sun reaching its daily peak position at 12 noon. And if you want to see the nitty-gritty details, Google equation of time. By the way, large railway systems in the US and Canada adopted standard time at noon 140 years ago today. So as I said, we go to daylight saving time in the spring, and we move clocks back by 1 hour in the fall, as we did two weekends ago. It's observed in most of the United States. Only Hawaii and most of Arizona remain on standard time year-round. It's observed in many nations, though starting and ending on various dates, usually called summertime, such as British summertime. So what do public polls show about this clock change method? Before we look at the pro, let's do pro polls. Let's look at the, do a non-scientific poll, I guess you'd say, right here. So how many of you raise your hands or type yes if you've got the chat window? How many of you want to continue what we're doing now, that is change clocks? All right. And how many of you, and type online or raise your hands here, are against changing clocks? All right, a narrow but real minority want to continue changing clocks. The majority says to keep it one way or another. And that does reflect, although it's much more lopsided in the real world, you'll see these polls in October of a couple years ago and March of last year. And one of them breaks out in terms of, well, young people, that is in their 20s, are a little more favorable towards changing the clocks. And 22% of older adults, that is age 60 or older, are okay with it. But you'll see huge majority is like, let's stop this. Another poll from March last year, even more lopsided, CBS News poll. In that case, only roughly 20%, 80% against changing clocks. And it also breaks out, sizable majority is for daylight saving time all year round, almost half, and only a third are for having the standard time be the year-round time. I do have a suggestion for the next public poll on this topic. Instead of conducting the poll in March or October when people are going to be sort of paying for the time change, they're going through the clock disruption to their sleep schedule and so on, ask during June or July when the public is redeeming the benefits of this. You might get an inaccurate result if you just keep asking how people like it or not during the clock change time of year. So I mentioned Dylan, and doggone it, the lyric kind of fits this. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. And they have. Legislators have enacted legislation or resolutions to provide for year-round daylight saving time. And the difference here is that voters authorized it in California, and the others are legislatures. Nearest to us is Delaware.
I just can't hear it, you're not projecting enough.
Understood. So the U.S. Senate passed the Sunshine Protection Act of 2021 during the 117th Congress last year. We're now in the 118th. This act would have allowed states to observe year-round daylight saving time. And the House didn't take action, so the bill died there. The Sunshine Protection Act has been reintroduced this year, and it's in committee in both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Just wanted to emphasize that this was necessary in order that these states that wanted to switch to year-round daylight saving time could not do it without this act of Congress. So when I heard the Senate had passed this last year, I was a little bit shocked because I remember we tried this before and it didn't last. It bombed badly. In the US, this was before my time, but World War II, so a few years. And then, as I mentioned, in 1974, so that winter, instead of waiting until April when the clock changing was done back then, it was instituted right in the middle of the winter. And you can see here, before that switch was made, people were gung-ho for this. The polls show almost 80% was for this permanent daylight saving time. And then after a few months of trying it, it plummeted to 40%. And also in the United Kingdom, this was tried for 3 years. And if there are Beatles fans watching, I know there's some in this room, that's during a very interesting time. The Peter Jackson Get Back films that came out a couple of years ago really let us get a great look at what the Beatles were doing in January 1969 while they were rehearsing for a live performance and bickering. And the world they lived in was sunrise at the start of the workday. So the daylight saving time clock change, and the sun wouldn't rise until 9 a.m. local. I realize they probably had other issues they were dealing with over the years. I'm thinking it may not have helped. So anyway, I don't know if any Beatle historians have considered this as potentially an aspect, but it did occur to me. So as I mentioned, it's been tried before. It has been 50 years since it was last tried, although I should mention that in Russia, it was tried from 2011 through 2014 with permanent daylight savings all year round. I didn't really focus on that because, be honest with you, it seems like a pretty dysfunctional society. And if Putin or any of his people are watching, that's right, I'm talking about you. And anyway, that may not be something particularly worthwhile to study, but you know, the United States, the United Kingdom, it seems like what are we going to achieve if we try this again? So it has been a long time since then, many years. So maybe it is worth trying again. But has anything relevant changed over the years? Certainly not the physics. So let's go over that quickly. Since we're talking about daylight, let's take a sun's eye view of Earth, right? And obviously we don't have a camera on the sun, but we sort of have the next best thing, which is a camera between the Earth and sun. It's called the Deep Space Climate Observatory, DISCOVER, and it's 1 million miles from Earth, and it's not exactly on the line connecting sun and Earth, but it's very, very close enough. By the way, a couple of my coworkers support that mission. I don't know if they'll ever watch this, but I'll salute Mark and Dave. And what you're seeing here on the left is the September equinox, and on the right is the March equinox. And I picked a particular time when North and South America would be roughly in the same east-west position. And in both cases, the equator is exactly through the middle, and north is up in both. And let's make this a little bit more sun's eye view realistic. As you know, probably the Earth's axis, the rotational axis, is tilted with respect to the plane of the orbit. So it's 23.5 degrees. So this is a little closer to what a sun's eye view would be. And that's the rotational axis of Earth. And it's perfectly flush with the plane of this slide, right? And the equator, as I said, is right through. Oops. And most notably, our daylight here, regardless of latitude, Jimmy Buffett saying of changes in latitude, changes in attitude. Well, maybe, but it doesn't have any effect on the daylight duration. It's 12 hours everywhere at this circumstance, both of the equinox circumstances. So regardless of what your latitude is, I should say at the poles, at both poles you'll see the sun creeping along the horizon actually for the entire 24 hours. All right, that's at the March and September equinox. Let's have a look at the solstice when it's most pronounced difference in the daylight duration. So over here is the December solstice sun's eye view, and North America, well, the sun just doesn't see it very well, as you might expect, and South America is quite prominent, whereas in June, North America is easily visible, and South America is a little bit off the edge there. And of course, there's the rotational axis. Again, 23.5 degrees, but instead of being flush with the slide, it's sticking out of the South Pole here, and below the surface, sticking down. This is in next month, about a month from now. And then, of course, in June, it's reversed with the North Pole axis sticking 23.5 degrees above the surface and below here. Well, what is the impact on daylight duration? It's just what you would expect. Picking a latitude where Washington, D.C. and many other places, of course, they're going to get 9.5 hours of daylight. The equator, 12 hours, just like at September and March equinox. And I picked, I think, Santiago. They get 14.5 hours. And then this fascinating area in the Antarctic Circle where the sun doesn't set for quite a while, and that's marked there. And then, of course, in June, everything's reversed. North Pole, the Arctic Circle, and Washington's latitude is now getting 15 hours, so that's quite a difference. The shortest day of the year, roughly 9.5, roughly 15 in the longest. and then the rest here. All right, as you would imagine, noon is halfway through daytime. Therefore, sunrise and sunset occur at daytime duration divided by 2 hours before and afternoon. So that means morning and afternoon last 4.75 hours, 4 hours and 45 minutes. In the winter and in the summer up here at this latitude, 7.5 hours. All right, we've come to the reason for all of this discussion. Most people don't wake up until an hour or more after summer sunrise. You see here 4:30 a.m. Remember, 7.5 hours before noon is when June and July, to an extent, sunrises occur, and sunsets at 7:30, 7.5 hours after noon. And back in 1907, a gentleman in England, William Willett, a builder, he wrote and published this pamphlet, The Waste of Daylight. Pre-waking daylight is wasted, hence the term daylight saving time. It makes sense now because most people are like, we're not saving anything. Yet, yes, we are. We're not wasting it by sleeping through it. So our good friend at the Washington Post, Joel Achenbach, said a few years ago, daylight saving time does not really save daylight. It should be called daylight shifting time. And by the way, we gave him our Philip J. Klass Award 12 years ago, and that's for outstanding contributions in promoting critical thinking and scientific understanding. I'll respectfully differ with Joel on this. I would instead call it, instead of shifted time, as he suggested, evening daylight time. It's certainly not morning daylight time. So by that nomenclature, evening daylight time equals daylight saving time, and morning daylight time equals standard time. This can help your brain get into that, weighing the pros and cons of this, I think, pretty quickly and sustain that. So how can we access the pre-waking sunlight of summer so that we don't waste it anymore, as Willett said? Well, one of them is just get up earlier, rise with the sun, right? So as I said in DC, it's like 4:30 to 5 a.m. in June, July. Even in August, you're not going to see the sun before 5:30. And another gentleman, actually predating Willett, but not as well known in New Zealand, a gentleman named George Hudson, he said, hey, we should do this. Unfortunately, because of this early sunrise, people take some of their recreation before their daily work and some after. And then he says, which in many cases results in their having to forego pursuits they could enjoy if the daylight leisure time were continuous. Okay. So there are two methods to access the pre-waking sunlight of summer. There's the clock method we know and hate, I guess. And of course, as I mentioned, that's set clocks 1 hour ahead to daylight saving time. And then the other is what one might call the habits method. Change habits, wake up earlier and work from 8 to 4 instead of 9 to 5. So no one's changed the clock, you're just showing up earlier and leaving early. And of course, I'm saying 8 to 4, different businesses or schools or what have you have different work schedules. You subtract 1 in that same way. And of course, there's the famous movie and song by Dolly Parton, Working 9 to 5. Maybe she could make a new version, working 8 to 4, that you'd hear during the summer. I don't know. Just a thought of like how to get people thinking about that. This Hudson fellow I mentioned, he gave this talk before the Wellington, New Zealand Philosophical Society. He considered, well, we could alter our habits during the summer and leave the clocks alone. And he said, such an alteration in habits would be wholly impracticable. I tend to agree. Let's entertain this notion, though, for amusement. Can you imagine the habits method? So let's say 9 a.m. Saturday, March 11th, of this year, at the start of work, the manager addresses her employees. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you for your good work. Just a reminder that we will reconvene here in 23 hours. All right, enjoy your work today. Let's do great things. So they show up 23 hours later, and then their work schedule is 24, 24, 24 for months and months, till 2 weeks ago, 8 a.m. Of course, they're working 8 to 4, as I said. November 4th, the manager's back. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your good work. Just a reminder that we reconvene here in 25 hours. Enjoy your work today. So anyway, it's clear why no one likes either of these methods. We're circadian beings. We're accustomed to 24-hour cycles. At the March change, everyone has to wake up 23 hours after previously awakening. And then this one maybe isn't as bad. You get your extra sleep here. Everyone has to wake up 25 hours later. The change does occur mid-weekend to soften the impact, but let's face it, nobody likes this. The polls show that. What if we were to abandon the 1-hour adjustments then? It's a gimmick. Always use standard time or daylight saving time. So we'll look at any place that has the same latitude as Washington, and of course the details vary as you go farther from the equator or closer. But let's look at our community. So up here at the top we have a standard time workday, that's 9 to 5. And at the bottom is the 8 to 4 workday that represents daylight saving time. And you can see here this yellow bar represents the duration of sunlight at the shortest day of the year. And there's some variation as you go through December, late December into January, but basically it's the same situation. And you'll see here, you have a couple hours before showing up to work for standard time where the sun's been up. And then it does set roughly 15 minutes before you knock off work at 5 p.m. The situation for daylight saving time, you can see there's much less sunlight prior to showing up at work. So you awaken in darkness. You travel to work in darkness. And as you might imagine, in the winter, it's pretty cold then. It's as cold as it gets on any particular day unless like a cold front is coming through or something. On the plus side, you do travel home in daylight. So that's 45 minutes roughly after leaving work. Let's look at summer. Well, obviously, this is the plentiful sunlight situation. And here is George Hudson's continuous daylight leisure he spoke of. So instead of 2.5 hours after knocking off your standard time, you have 3.5 hours before sun sets. So looking at our three options, one is the clock change. Disrupts our sleep schedule twice a year. Daylight saving time only, awaken before sunrise during the winter months. Sleep researchers claim that this is very bad. We'll be focusing on that shortly. And I know this from personal experience. 1974, kids to school in the dark, dangerous, depressing to get up at that hour. What about standard time only? Well, we'll have less sunlight after work and less shopping and outdoor activities, more crime. Let's try some troubleshooting. So what if we were to change our schedule gradually, such as 15 minutes a day for 4 days? So Thursday night, obviously we do the Saturday night, Sunday morning changeover. On a Thursday night, you go to bed at 15 minutes in whichever direction, and so forth. And then by Monday morning, you are maybe a little more acclimated to your new schedule. What about DST only using a troubleshooting method? Well, what if we use special lights? I'll discuss that in a couple slides. Kids to school in the dark, later school start time, cell phone flashlights. We didn't have those back in 1974. We just had to carry the big, special, regular flashlight. reflective gear like you might see in Halloween trick-or-treating. What about this? I don't know if anyone has suggested this. Remote learning until sometime after sunrise. So say the school starts an hour before sunrise, the kids can meet with their teacher online, and then at a particular appropriate time after sunrise saying, all right, that concludes this. I'll see you all in a half hour, whatever it is to travel to school. How about communities, especially cities that are far from the equator, such as in Scandinavian countries, or Iceland? I called that out, in particular the capital, Reykjavik. I actually contacted the embassy of Iceland, and they did send me some materials, and when I read through them, there was nothing about here's how you're going to cope with going to school in the dark. They have very short daytime during the winter, and it seems like they've got it so well sorted out that they don't even mention their method. Just by coincidence, a friend of mine and her husband arrived in Iceland yesterday, and yes, I did ask her, hey, would you ask folks how they get their kids to and from? So it's just a coincidence. I didn't convince her to go on a fact-finding mission. It may just turn out that way. But anyway, she's having a great time in spite of this concern of the volcanic activity there. What about standard time, though? This one I drew blanks. I don't know how to troubleshoot the less shopping and outdoor activities or more crime. And I'd like to briefly toss this out to anyone online in the chat window, here in person. Any thoughts what we might be able to do? Maybe spend a minute or two in trying to figure out, okay, the sun sets, sooner after work ends, and yet things will be all right. People will go in the dark to shop or do outdoor activities, or we can deal, criminals generally like to operate with less light, and so sunshine is in many cases their enemy. Anyway, any brainstorming? Admittedly, it's a pop quiz for you. Yes, I'll repeat your comment.
Okay, two things. In addition to shopping, outdoor activities, I've always suspected that golf had a lot to do with this. How long it takes to play 9 holes, enjoying a good beer and meeting up with people, playing at least 9 holes of golf after work. The other thing, though, is agriculture used to involve a lot of children, family farms. And after school, there'd be 1 more hour of daylight for that after-school work in the spring and in the fall for harvesting. So those two things, I think, have been big drivers.
Mm-hmm. Your first comment was about golf. The idea, let's maximize as much sunlight after work so that you can get your holes in, and then also socialize. And the second point that you made about farmers, I wasn't quite clear about that. So the kids come home to their farms after school, and they can help out on the farm if there's a little bit more light. Typically, farmers were against a daylight saving time. And so I think modern farmers, though, from what I've gathered by researching, and of course, I'm not an expert, I'm merely researching, it looks like modern farm methods and also modern farm culture where the farmer has a day job and they're able to do a lot of their work when they get home using modern machinery and so forth. So they used to be big opponents to daylight saving time, and now they're a little bit more conciliatory and open towards it. All right, so obviously there's a lot of action trying to get daylight saving time to be a year-round thing where states would be able to choose which method they're on to try to get away from clock changing. There is movement within scientific and medical communities to say, let's go permanently standard time. For instance, a year ago, the American Medical Association called for permanent standard time. In particular, this NPR interview, cardiologist, he says, it's just a 1 hour change, but this shows how sensitive our bodies may be to circadian rhythm disruptions. The comment being, daylight saving time, brighter, longer evenings make it harder to fall asleep. You don't get enough sleep, and then you wake up in the winter to, the sun hasn't even risen yet, so you have a lot of trouble getting your body going. This group is called the Coalition for Permanent Standard Time, and it comprises several organizations: the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, National Sleep Foundation, a Sleep Research Society, and so on. And their website is savestandardtime.com. And actually, some of them were in town a few days ago on Capitol Hill at the Rayburn House Office Building. Various sleep research and other experts. One of them in particular, Dr. Beth Mallow, MD, from Vanderbilt University Medical Center. She kindly replied to an email from me a few days ago. She's a professor of neurology, among other things. So I'll put in red an abridgment, and I've captured the meaning here without overflowing a PowerPoint slide. So my question to her in one of my in my email was, is your concern generalizable that people shouldn't awaken before sunrise regardless of daylight saving time or standard time? Would this be a general health issue for the part of the public that gets up so early to go to work? She says this is correct. So there's clarity here now. They're very active in, hey, don't go to year-round daylight saving time, but really the core of their action is try to minimize the number of people that get up before the sun. That's the one that is the killer, the harmer. But then I said, well, what about traveling across time zones? So she says crossing one time zone is easier to acclimate than a clock change to daylight saving time or standard time. And this did puzzle me a bit. She didn't see this final one. I share this here, and maybe someone will fill in this question for me. It says, but this seems to suggest that a person can quickly adjust their waking time, whether it's exposure to sunlight after 23 hours in DC, as would happen with a clock change in March, or during your first Bermuda morning. That's presumably equivalent, right? So you go 23 hours between seeing the sun, whether you've opened your shade an hour earlier in Washington, or you've gone on a flight to Bermuda and you see the sun rise 23 hours after you last saw it in Washington. By the way, I mentioned that there are other nations using daylight saving time for some of the year, and a lot of Europe, all of the United States, as I mentioned, except Hawaii and most of Arizona, and then these other areas. But the reason I looked in on that is Spain is essentially never on standard time. It's always on either daylight saving time or double daylight saving time. So they're 2 hours ahead of their natural time zone. Their natural time zone would be the Greenwich Mean Time of England and so forth. And they are on the same time zone as the rest of Western Europe, which is understandable in some commerce aspect, but it does put their population into this situation that sleep researchers consider to be very hazardous. And it's been on this for over 80 years. You can see 1940 was the last time they lived under standard time. So my question for Dr. Mallow on this was, forgive me for all the text, I'll read it. Hawaii and Arizona could be excellent case studies of year-round standard time, But wouldn't Spain be an excellent case study of year-round daylight saving time? They haven't been on standard time since 1940. Wouldn't your hypothesis suggest that the health of their citizens should be unusually poor? Worse still, they're on double daylight saving time for most of the year, returning to daylight saving time only during winter months. Yet, World Health Organization data from a few years ago show that life expectancy in Spain is 5th highest in the world. This would seem to contradict your hypothesis, or at least give pause in accepting it. And then, of course, I've got to bring in, there could be confounding factors. Maybe they've adjusted after many continuous decades on that time of daylight saving, or genetic factors, diet, environment, et cetera, may compensate for the bad effects. And her response was, well, maybe, as you say, those confounding factors. Also, they have the afternoon siesta, which helps compensate for sleep loss. Now, my understanding is that siestas are not as prevalent in the modern Spanish society as it used to be. I don't know if that would contradict my thought of, hey, we need to look at Spain much more closely, because it seems like they're doing fine or actually great, and yet they're not on standard time. At least I want to kind of plant that question with the experts and see what comes out of it. Here's the World Health Organization data that I mentioned. All right, again, continuing with the sleep researchers, neurologists and so forth that say, look, this is hazardous. To wake up before sunrise. They point out, to obesity risk, for example. And then my question would be, wouldn't that suggest that Arizonans, year-round standard time, would fare better than New Mexicans, who are clock changing most months of the year on daylight saving time? And yet, if you look at the pre-COVID, obviously COVID put our obesity problem into overdrive. But anyway, that New Mexico, which is on daylight saving time much of the year, and Arizona, which is on standard time, they're roughly the same percentage, 31 or so percent of adults are considered obese. Now, there is some of Arizona that does observe daylight saving time for that part of the year. So that is another confounding factor. All right, here's another one. Again, I'm a non-expert looking in, wanting to ask questions of experts. Studies show clock change, and it's only when we go to daylight saving time, equals increased incidence of stroke and heart attack. And then my question, and again, I would love to have seen someone ask this question before. It may have been done, but it's not easily seen. Could this effect be due to people suddenly exercising more because there's suddenly more after-work daylight? That may also explain why incidence drops suddenly when after-work daylight vanishes, because people stop or reduce exercising. One final thing, and that is, I noticed that this Capitol Hill event with Dr. Mallow and the others started at 8 a.m., and that's only an hour after sunrise. And I did ask Dr. Mallow, hey, what was your technique so that you showed up at 8 a.m. even though it's only an hour after sunrise? And, I don't know what the answer is. Maybe, the obvious thing would be it's okay to do that once in a while, not to make a habit of it. That would be my speculation. They had a Q&A with the news media after this presentation. I hope at least one reporter asked. We here at NCAS a year ago, we had a few programs about the news media, and they will often omit things that would tend to make a reader or viewer come to a different conclusion. But also sometimes it seems like they're not paying attention and asking questions that would be helpful. And if I'd been there, I would have said, hey, how did you have to get up before sunrise today? At least to see what they say, right? All right, so this is this group I had mentioned with the briefing on Capitol Hill and so on. savestandardtime.com. I highly recommend it. They've got this great chart, and it isn't called, "Are you sure you want to do that?" That's my name for it. Here's a great example. If we have year-round daylight saving time in Seattle, that means the winter workday starts at sunrise. So you set your clock to DST, you're not going to see sunrise until 9 a.m. there. Here's the weird thing. One of their two senators, maybe both, definitely one of them, from Washington State, she's a huge proponent of the Sunshine Protection Act that would cause year-round daylight saving time, including the Seattle situation. So I found a few interviews with her on YouTube, news folks interviewing her. Ask her, hey, what about sunrise at 9 a.m.? None of them asked. It's, oh, I want to grab them by the lapels. We have a question here.
I have a comment. Well, one of the questions would be asked to that senator, do you actually live in Washington State?
Right, so
do you live in D.C.? Is that your actual
right.
residence?
So the comment from one of our audience members here in the room in Bethesda, Maryland, is to ask the senator how long she spends in state, up in Washington, or down here in the Washington, D.C. area, working. And my guess is that maybe she gets back up there for a weekend or something like that.
She's there in the summer.
She shows up every 6 years for the election.
Oh, and also during,
It's in the summer.
and also another of our in-person audience here points out that the August recess that Congress observes, she would be back in her home state during the plentiful sunlight season there. So anyway, that would also be an excellent question. Thank you, gentlemen. All right, here's another part of this perspective I've described. The chancellor of UCLA, a biologist named Gene Block, which is an awesome name, I didn't make that up, and a colleague, a neurophysiologist named Johanna Meyer, argue for year-round standard time, but they acknowledge, as I read here, many countries in the far north, such as Norway, have innovative artificial lighting strategies to deal with excessive winter darkness. We can certainly learn from their experience, but we also have choices that those in the far north do not. That's sort of where my brain is heading in this. Specifically, we can learn from their experience. 50 years ago we tried something and we didn't use the lessons learned from their experience, so maybe that's a worthwhile thing. In any case, regardless of standard time year-round or daylight saving time year-round, many people awaken before sunrise. This poses health problems that need to be solved. I think there's some consensus about this. Again, non-expert looking at what experts seem to be converging to. Perhaps there could be a societal push for everyone to simply wait until sunrise before getting any daily activities going, but that may be impossible to achieve. Let's face it, we need to get our cities going, public transportation and so forth. Here I go, unsolicited advice. Again, I don't represent NCAS, just my personal opinion. Let's heed the warning of the don't wake up in the dark science community. Not only do they claim to have studies and so forth, just by pure reason, it seems likely that our species was reacting to the sounds of birds in the morning, the light of sunrise, and so forth. But let's solve the early risers problem, which is inevitable. There's going to be people waking up before sunrise, and go for the summer evening light. Let's try the year-round daylight saving time experiment again. It's been 50 years. On one condition, I suggest. Artificial morning light, slowly brightening, starting 8 hours after bedtime. If you don't easily perceive the lamp, such as you're hiding under the covers, yes, that's me on occasion, use the bird songs alarm, which is in any case probably much better than the loud sudden beep of many old-fashioned or the ringing bells and so on. This isn't an ad, it's just an idea. If people want to explore this on their own, that's the basic gist of it. So It can be adjusted. You want to imitate your sunrise, and you can have it brighten over a period of 30 minutes, say, or adjust it. You have bird songs that you can select, and so on. The color of it. So I would think you want to imitate a rising sun color-wise. And to continue, my recommendation is let's not implement this quickly. Let's wait for a few years from now to allow more studies to occur. And of course, that's the cliche for scientists, right? They give a talk and they say, more research needs to be done. But it's true. And I just want to point out that someone has just entered, almost as if they were coming early for a daylight saving time talk. Okay. The gentleman says it was just traffic delaying them. But anyway, for example, more studies to occur would be, let's compare Arizona residents' quality of life, year-round standard time, against their neighbors in New Mexico, their quality of life in the clock-changing world. And also, by waiting a few years, we can give time for the public to prepare, such as purchasing morning light lamps. In the meantime, I offer this with no warranty or guarantees, but here's how you can be a rebel. So if you want to live year-round in standard time, in March, change your clock like everyone else, and then show up for work from 10 to 6. Now, I don't know if your management would allow that or any other, your vendors or whatever, your customer base. Anyway, in November, change your clock like everyone else and then start working from 9 to 5. And then, as you might imagine, the same kind of technique for daylight saving time with different numbers. So just like steps 1 and 3 are the same. You change your clock like everyone else. In the summer, you work from 9 to 5, and in the winter, you work from 8 to 4. And as I mentioned earlier, gotta watch that. That's the one where the scientists and reason seem to suggest don't get up before sunrise. It's not good for you health-wise. What if this daylight saving time experiment that we start, say, a few years from now fails? For example, the lamps are too expensive. Gosh, it's like $40 or something. I realize people do get smartphones and so on that are more expensive. This may be where this experiment falls to pieces. What if transportation accidents unambiguously increase? Or flat out just public sentiment turns against it? What do we do then? Can we directly access the summer morning light of standard time? This nice, between this tick mark and sunrise here. Can we access that summer morning light of standard time for leisure pursuits, as New Zealander George Hudson back in 1898 suggested? There it is, 4.5 hours between sunrise and the start of the workday. Well, one question I asked, I work at NASA, what do astronauts do? They're supported by world-class health experts. So I looked at the International Space Station Expedition 40, this is from about 9 years ago, their daily schedule, and of course you can't see the detail here, but I've distilled it here at the bottom. Their physical exercise sessions started no earlier than 3 hours after awakening, over here at the left, and their exercise ended no later than 2.5 hours before sleep, over here on the right. Oh, quick comment. The crew of 6, one of them here that you won't be able to see, you'll need to take my word for it, which isn't good for skeptics. We always trust but verify. But anyway, Reed Weissman, Maryland native, flight engineer on Expedition 40 from Baltimore, and he's going to command Artemis 2 next year. So at the end of, near the end of 2024, he and a crew of 4 are going to circle the moon and return to Earth. First mission to lunar orbit since 1972. And I got to meet him briefly when he and his crewmates visited Goddard back in May, and chatted with each of them. And one of his crewmates is Christina Cook. She's going to be the first woman to circle the moon. And she was also on my softball team 20 years ago at Goddard. But anyway, so yeah, it looks to me like maybe we should not be exploiting this for the exercise that is so helpful in the evening hours. I should say that this website that said, let's just go to standard time year-round, they presented studies on their YouTube page. So if you go to Save Standard Time on YouTube, you'll see these very professional videos with subject matter experts, but it's not persuasive. It's very one-sided to the point where they don't even grant that there could be any possible benefit to daylight saving time. And it makes me feel like, hey, I'm not getting the full story here. Here's one example. So they highlighted a study that showed, look, kids aren't exercising after daylight saving time starts. And my thought is, well, let's get them to make good use of that time. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have daylight saving time. It just means it isn't being properly utilized. So anyway, it's a fascinating thing if you watch these videos. They only last a few minutes and there's a dozen or so. And to watch them to sort of like, it's a great way to kind of get your brain inquiring, and you're dealing with subject matter experts. And I would love to say, hey, what about this? What about this? And my hope is that, you know, there will be answers, and it's like, oh, okay, I get it. I shouldn't have even brought up the question, perhaps. I grant that possibility. All right, so again, my unsolicited advice has nothing to do with NCAS or any other organization I have worked with or whatever. If year-round daylight saving time fails, let's return to clock changing routines and just manage them better. Use lamps or the morning sun, if available, to acclimate yourself before or during the clock change weekend. And adjust your bedtime gradually, starting a few or several days before the clock change. So I had mentioned 4 days of 15 minutes each to get you that 60-minute change. Maybe it's several days, 10 days of 6 minutes. I realized that sunrise times only change by about a minute per day. So we cannot perfectly mimic this by changing our wake-up time by 1 minute per day to get to that 1 hour. That would take 2 months. But I think it's possible that humans do have the resilience, the physical capabilities. That's another aspect about this, if I may, and that is maybe all of this reflects our general lack of well-being, our general degradation of health, that we're not exercising, not sleeping enough, not eating well enough, or eating too much, or bad foods and so forth, and that our parents and grandparents were doing fine since the 1960s of, you know, the country being on standard time, switching to daylight saving time, and now we're not as healthy, and so these clock changes are tougher on us. Perhaps we just need to get healthier, and then that's a big part of dealing with clock changing and accessing that precious hour. So here's my conclusion. Science tells us, based on these studies I've touched on, that accessing an extra hour of after-work sunlight is bad for us, even though we like it. But my feeling is, let's earn, or at least try to earn, that extra hour safely and scientifically. And there's that hour. That's what we're fighting for. And it might be worthwhile in terms of reducing obesity, while offsetting obesity risks using morning light, artificial if necessary. That concludes this, and I'm ready to take questions online. And I think there's a microphone available. I can otherwise repeat the question. And comments are also welcome. I definitely wanted to have a very active, rather than me telling you things. And to have, if you have knowledge about this that may contradict or clarify some of it. Oh, thank you. Yes, Marv?
Questions from the chat. As far as I can tell, seasonal affective disorder, which millions suffer from, is therefore a serious problem, isn't part of the debate. Am I right?
Yes, the question was about seasonal affective disorder, such as the shorter daylight intervals of winter can cause depression and so forth, sometimes suicidal feelings. And the way that that is treated in many cases by professionals is by light. So you have artificial light. Typically it's in the morning is considered to be more beneficial than later in the day, although I believe it's done in both cases. Again, a risk of me as a non-expert, but if I'm summarizing this correctly, I believe that's the case. It is a risk, and that my suggested experiment would possibly protect against these SAD, as in seasonal affective disorder, the acronym, episodes. Any other questions, comments?
Another one.
Yes.
Maybe I missed it, but is there an observed increase in crime with permanent same time?
The idea is that crime increases after sunset. The assailants believe, whether falsely or not, that it's easier for them to do what they want to do and not get caught or identified after darkness. And then there's statistics that show this, that it may be temporary or a minor uptick. My thought is by reason, it's probably very likely that criminals are more active after dark. And I mean, one thing is to simply improve our law enforcement and give alternatives to potential assailants where they don't have to take such risks in order to get money or whatever other things that they want. Some of them may want to, be violent, and maybe a psychiatric type of treatment would be in order there. But to try to keep the public away from people who think, hey, once it's dark, I can start to attack. And daylight saving time is great for that. Is there another, Marv?
There's a suggestion, which you haven't mentioned. Let's go with UTC worldwide, meaning the entire world is on the same time zone.
Mm-hmm.
And then you pick the time.
Did you happen to notice who posted that?
David Elman Smith.
Okay. Oh, he's from the Bay Area Skeptics. I salute him and the Bay Area Skeptics. You're not going to believe this. If I was an evil person, I would claim that I had psychic powers. So I have bonus slides that I was going to bring up if we had no questions or comments. And here it is, David, and any other psychics that were here. So David of the Bay Area Skeptics suggested, hey, why don't we go to worldwide universal time? So a quick way of describing this is, if I asked you what time it is, you would say right now 1830, if I'm doing my math. 1930, sorry. Right here in my talk I mess up. Anyway, 1930, and if I called someone in Sydney, Australia, they would say, oh yes, it's 1930. And anywhere in the world, everyone would agree this is the time that we use to make appointments or to say a game is going to start or what have you. So anyway, it's an unambiguous choice for when will or when did something occur. All our computers, smartphones, etc., already use this time, and then they just apply a time zone adjustment. Some of those time zone adjustments are a little bit weird, like 30 minutes for Newfoundland, I think. A geographer in the room here is help me out on that. Time zones will then become irrelevant. Their boundaries vanish. The international date line vanishes. the bottom line, we decouple our daily clock from the local sun position. We'll know our local noon's universal time. Here it's 17. The chief shortcoming, which is change of date during daytime or business hours, is overcome by implementing proven techniques used during overnight business activity, like people at hospitals or fire and rescue, police. They have reports when they're working overnight. This is November 1819, Saturday, Sunday, etc. And for those of you who hate clock adjustments, it's highly resistant to seasonal adjustment. No one's going to recommend, hey, let's change universal time locally by 1 hour for several months each year. So it might be a way to get to where so many people want. Listen, they're going to be rebels, but the rest of us can quickly discover what their time means. Meanwhile, there will be ongoing incentives for the rebels to move themselves to universal time. And let's face it, once you're decoupling your daily clock from the local sun position, you're going to feel much more free to change your habits instead of your clocks. If you're against changing clocks, this is a solution for you. Now, I know that we have business people in this room and that you have particular opening and closing hours. And I don't know how comfortable you would feel. Some businesses are very open to, hey, here are May to September hours, and here are September to April hours or whatever. And I don't know if business people would like that. And of course, the whole idea of adjusting the clock is that we are all synchronized perfectly. But let's face it, we're already kind of doing our own thing. Some businesses open 3 hours after sunrise, some open 4 hours after sunrise, some open 5 hours after sunrise. So we already are kind of, what do they call that, free range. Here's a case that I want to emphasize. So the idea of time zone boundary communities. Here's one, Phoenix City, and that is the way they spell it, Alabama, Central Time. Columbus, Georgia, Eastern Time, and they're right next to each other. You can cross, I spoke with the mayor, yes, I spoke with the mayor a couple days ago of Phoenix City. Says you can ride a zip wire from our town to the other one in a matter of seconds. Anyway, as I said, one is on Central Time, the other is on Eastern Time, but that's not what really happens. People in Phoenix City, they live life as if they're on Eastern Time. They're so close. Columbus is bigger. And so what they do is they have to switch off their smartphone, auto clock set, where it would try to force the time zone. And so then also they just live through a clock change. So I talked to two residents, one of Columbus and one of Phoenix City recently, and the upheaval that occurs when the poor devils have to change their clocks because of the daylight saving time and standard time. Who were these folks? They were librarians. It's a great way. You call up, and it's like, oh, there's a library in Phoenix City. I'll call up, and they're very happy. Let's see, her name was Anna. And then I didn't get the gentleman I talked to, his name in Columbus. And I did say, hey, this is going to be live streamed. I don't know if they're going to comment or maybe they'll watch this later or whatever. But anyway, very difficult for them to deal with this. And they use informal methods, but there are formal methods. Either Congress can redefine the local boundary, or the U.S. Department of Transportation can officially change a time zone boundary in the U.S. if, for example, county officials submit a petition. So like there was one in, I think, North Dakota 13 years ago that moved from the mountain time zone into central time. Yes, we have a question
I have a
or comment.
about where you're on time zone boundary communities. My wife grew up in Union City, Indiana, which is right on the border with Ohio. And in fact, part of the town is actually in Ohio. and that's the boundary line between Eastern and Central. And so you would have, when people would plan things, you would have to specify, are we on, we're gonna have this, we're gonna meet, is this on Indiana time or is this on Ohio time?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
they have to write that on notes and things like that. They live with it well, they still live with it. I mean,
Yes.
there's-
So what you've done is you've described a community where your wife grew up on the border between Indiana and Ohio, which is where the dividing line between Eastern time zone and Central time zone is, and they always have to be very careful to get the time zone along with, hey, let's meet at such and such hour. And a couple of things, like when I talk to these Phoenix City and Columbus people, they're like, yeah, when people are using Google Maps to navigate and say when they're going to arrive, it's completely confusing to them. And so on. So anyway, obviously, these aren't huge population centers, and they cope, but we should probably expect these communities to increase in population. And here's why. Many of these time zone boundaries are along state boundaries, and there could be incentives for people to flock to state boundaries. Tax laws in one state as compared to the neighboring state, where it's like, oh, it would be better for me to live in this state and commute to a job in the or shop or whatever in the other state. So there's possibly a magnet to increase the populations of these communities. So anyway, the idea of going to universal time worldwide would make this problem go away. And then you may say, Scott, we'll just basically we'll have half hour instead of hour time zones. I think that may be right. I think the communities that are near the boundaries will probably go to, hey, we're going to open our business at 8:30. I'm sorry, I should say, let's say 3 hours before local noon. So local noon is at 18 in St. Louis. So someone in St. Louis would be on that time, but somewhere away from there would start their day at a half hour, right? So instead of 15 universal time, they would start at 15:30, for example. But that's fine, because that would still be hundreds of miles between. I don't think anyone is going to start or close their business on the quarter hour, say 15 or 45. They would use the top of the hour or the bottom of the hour. And of course, some people would be like, look, let's just stay on the top of the hour because of the vendor 300 miles away or something like that. And that's great. We already have variety. We already have free range start times for our businesses. Starbucks open at a particular time. They're not open in the evening, as I know too well. It's like, oh, I would have liked to have gotten a brownie, but they close at 6 or something like that. Or I should say 6 hours after local noon. Here are some typical workday hours by this universal time worldwide. So as I said, a typical workday starts 3 hours before noon. That's when the sun peaks, and ends 5 hours after noon. So in Washington, D.C., or anywhere in this area, the sun peaks at about 17 UT. So our workday would be 14 to 22 universal time. Or if we did a summer workday where everyone says, or you have an app, and it's like, hey, this weekend we're going to start working an hour earlier. We go from 13 to 21. And then I mentioned St. Louis, Missouri. Their noon is at 18 UT. So their workday would be 15 to 23 UT. And perhaps they would observe a summer workday of 14 to 22 UT. And we have to get Dolly in again to do all sorts of these work in 14 to 22. All right, I got to laugh. That's the important thing. Again, looking at other examples. Oh my God, Honolulu. What's going to happen to those folks? So their sun peaks at about 22:30. Remember I mentioned half hours might be a good fit rather than always being on the hour. So their workday might be 19:30 to 03:30. So their weekend spans 2 calendar days. Saturday, Sunday, Sunday, Monday would be their weekend. And their weekdays would be Monday, Tuesday, etc. through Friday, Saturday. All right, I mentioned Hawaii. I got to work this in. This is an exclusive. As far as I know, no one on Earth knows this, and it may not be important. Anyway, back in 2012, the planet Venus passed between Earth and the Sun, and it was really cool. It was like, oh wow, with proper like eclipse glasses, you can see Venus as close as it gets to Earth in silhouette. So you can get a sense of, oh, here's how big the closest planet looks in the sky. Anyway, so it's like, hey, I'm going to go with my brother to Hawaii, and we did. We had a great time. I also happen to be a member of the Planetary Society, and so I got this brochure. Hey, we're going to have a big, chartered adventure in Hawaii to see the transit of Venus from June 4th to 12th. And you can see here it's signed by their executive director. He's now their CEO. And the Planetary Society, of course, was founded by Carl Sagan, one of the great skeptics of all time. And gosh, Bill Nye's right up there. In fact, just a few weeks ago at the Skeptics Conference in Las Vegas, Richard Dawkins gave him the Dawkins Award, Bill Nye, one of our heroes. Anyway, so it says on June 6, 2012, and it's got all this. Uh-oh, they planned for the wrong day. I saw that and I was like, oh crap. I'm sorry, can you filter that out? So I shot him an email quickly, hey, you've got the wrong day. And so here's their itinerary. So you arrive on June 4th. And on June 5th, they're going to be snorkeling and so on. And then that evening, they're going to prepare for the Venus transit the next day. And I said, no, if you go snorkeling, you're going to miss the transit. And then they thought June 6th, the third day. So anyway, I'm sure other people immediately emailed them. I never heard back saying, hey, thanks, or yeah, you and a million other people warned us. Anyway, so they fixed it. So day 2, June 5th. But the funny thing is they still are arriving on June 4th. And it's like, okay, instead of afternoon at leisure, welcome dinner and orientation, a trip orientation, afternoon at leisure, welcome dinner and trip orientation, evening lecture and preparation for transit of Venus. So they had to sort of cram things in, and then they got the date right. So here they sent it out with a correction. So that's the incorrect June 6th and June 5th. And then they correctly had, hey, it's June 5th, 6th. So this is actually the expression of what I just showed as far as the workday in Hawaii. So you may say, all right, so there's a trade-off between those poor devils at time zone boundaries dealing with that, and then folks in Hawaii working through a calendar date change. Well, fortunately, the part of Earth that experiences this clock day change during normal business hours is relatively low population, and it will always be low population until artificial islands start going up in the Pacific. And I realize the Chinese Communist Party likes to do that. And yes, I'm talking about you too if you're watching. But at this time, it doesn't seem likely that there'll be huge populations working during calendar day changeovers in normal business hours. So anyway, is that it for, oh yes. So historic event dates, we have a gentleman that's very knowledgeable about history. So was it April 14th that Abraham Lincoln that evening was shot here in Washington, D.C.? So it would have been 10:30 Washington time, and it would be the next calendar day, universal time. So he was actually shot and perished on April 15th, 1865, Universal Time. And of course, those of us in the United States, we remember, if we're old enough, 10:56 p.m. is when Neil Armstrong became the first astronaut to set foot on the moon. And it's like, oh yes, July 20th, 1969. But if by this standard, it's actually July 21st, 1969. In fact, if you look in encyclopedias in Europe, they'll say, yes, humans first set foot on the moon on July 21st, 1969. So anyway, quick thing before we wrap up. I showed you Discover, the Deep Space Climate Observatory. Cool video here. That's Earth's moon passing in front of Earth. So anyway, that's the side of the moon that never faces Earth. So that's the far side of the moon. Fascinating area before humans ever saw it in 1959, I think, a Russian spacecraft. In fact, you can't see it easily here, but it doesn't have a man in the moon or anything. It's all lunar highlands, except for this Sea of Moscow. It's one of the lava basins. And so it's like that's the one detail that you see if you see the moon from the far side. But anyway, before 1959, there were some people that thought, hey, maybe the UFOs have a hidden base on the far side because they would know humans can't see that. That is the side that's always turned away from Earth. And then, of course, I mean, the mission I work on at Goddard has gotten tremendous views of the entire surface. And if there is evidence of alien artifacts or scoop marks or something like that, it's hidden in the data at best, if it's there at all. All right, I've run out of bonus material, and I apologize if anybody had good questions or comments in the meantime. And it's, I guess, maybe taking a few more minutes. I don't know if there's any. Marv, any?
Only other question was, has anyone suggested why not 10 minutes once a month instead of 60 minutes twice a year?
That's right. It was, I think it was Willett, the 1907 Englishman, his pamphlet, that suggested 20 minutes for 4 consecutive weekends to get you to 80 minutes. And so you know, 20, 20, 20, 20 to get you, he was greedy. He wanted 80 minutes of that morning sunlight, not just 60. And it didn't pass muster. It wasn't, and people can Google the history where it's like, oh, it's World War I and they called it wartime. Of course, Google yourself, knock yourself out. I didn't cover things that you would easily Google. I wanted to kind of pose questions for experts. So. I'm sorry, any other questions? Looks like you're still reading, so I'll keep the line open. All right, looks like things may have wrapped up. And thank you so much for your time. No irony intended. Oh, if am I still on? We're possibly going to be back here on the evening of December 6th, but consider that very tentative. Pencil. That's right. It's a Wednesday evening. That would be at 0 UT on Thursday the 7th. So if anyone immediately is hopping on this worldwide UT bandwagon, I've already put you to the test. Or the new day, calendar day, UT starts here at 7 p.m. on Wednesday local time, and it will be 0 UT on Thursday the 7th. So anyway, I didn't think about that until this very moment. But consider that tentative, and let's see how that goes. All right, thank you all so much, and online as well. And I want to emphasize, if anyone watches this later, please post comments down there, questions, criticisms. I'd like to be able to continue to access experts to answer those questions and perhaps correct anything that I garbled or left out of this presentation. Thank you, National Capital Area skeptics and interested public. Bye-bye.